In the ancient world, when two kings or two parties wanted to bind themselves together in an unbreakable promise, they did not draft a contract. They cut animals in half. They walked between the bloody pieces. They invoked their own death if they broke their word. The ceremony was not religious symbolism layered onto a transaction. It was a kind of self-imposed curse made visible. To enter a covenant was to put your life inside another person's word. And from Genesis to Revelation, the God of the Bible enters one of these ceremonies after another with the people he refuses to let go of. By the end of the story, the bloody path between the pieces leads to a cross. There are 5 covenants God makes in the Bible: with Noah, with Abraham, with Moses and Israel, with David, and the new covenant, which the prophets promised and which the cross fulfilled. Today we read all 5, not as separate stories, as one long arc that the entire Bible is bending toward. Start with the word. In Hebrew, the word for covenant is berith. It appears more than 200 times in the Old Testament. In Greek, the New Testament uses the word diatheke. Both words carry a meaning English struggles to translate. Berith is not a contract. It is not a treaty. It is not an agreement of mutual convenience. Berith is a bond of life, a relational commitment with consequences ratified in blood. And in the ancient Near East, the way you ratified a berith was startlingly physical. You took an animal, sometimes several, you killed it. You split the carcass down the middle, head to tail. You laid the 2 halves on the ground with a path between them, and the 2 parties making the covenant walked between the pieces. The implicit declaration was unmistakable. If I break this covenant, let what happened to this animal happen to me. The Hebrew idiom for making a covenant is karat berith, literally to cut a covenant. Not to sign one, not to swear one, to cut one. That is the foundation under every covenant in the Bible. But before there is a covenant with anyone, there is something simpler. There is a garden. The opening chapters of Genesis describe a relationship between God and the first humans that scholars sometimes call a covenant of creation, or the Edenic relationship. There is no animal cut in half. There is no ceremony, but there is something covenantal in shape. God makes them. God blesses them. God gives them everything. God gives them one boundary. Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. That is Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 through 17. And when they break the boundary, the story does not end. God comes walking in the garden in the cool of the day. He calls them. He clothes them. He sends them out, but he sends them out alive. The first failure of human faithfulness does not end the relationship. It begins a longer story. By the time we get to Noah, the story has gotten darker. Humanity has filled the earth with violence. The flood comes. And on the other side of the water, with the world washed clean, God does something the text has not described before. He cuts a covenant. That is where every other covenant in the Bible begins to build. And this is also where the pattern of biblical history takes its shape. From Eden onward, the Bible is not a string of unrelated stories. It is the slow unfolding of one relationship between God and humanity, structured by these bonds of life. Every covenant builds on the last. Every covenant is a step closer to the goal, and every covenant survives the failure of the human partner. The shape of the Bible is the shape of a God who keeps reaching toward a creation that keeps pulling back, and who keeps finding new ways to hold on anyway. Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 and 9. And God spake unto Noah, and to his sons with him, saying, And I, behold, I establish my covenant with you, and with your seed after you. This is the first time the word berith appears as a formal covenant in the Bible, and the first thing to notice is the scope. God is not making this covenant with one nation or one family. He is making it with Noah and his sons, which is to say, with all of humanity that will descend from them. And in verse 10, the scope widens further. God includes every living creature on the earth: birds, cattle, beasts, the whole biosphere. Look at the terms. God promises He will never again destroy the earth by a flood. He commits Himself unilaterally. The text does not say if Noah does X, God will do Y. There are no conditions. There is no path between bloody animal halves for both parties to walk. The covenant with Noah is one-sided in a way the later covenants are not. God binds Himself, and He binds no one else. And then the sign. Genesis chapter 9, verse 13. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. The Hebrew word for bow is kashet, the same word for the weapon, the bow of war, the instrument an archer pulls back to send an arrow into an enemy. And God says He is setting His kashet in the cloud, aimed, not at humanity, but up, the string toward the earth, the arrow toward heaven. The weapon of divine judgment is hung in the sky as a sign that God has stepped out of His own war. That is the first covenant, universal in scope, one-sided in obligation, sealed with a bow that no longer points at the earth. And it tells you something about the kind of God you are dealing with. He is not in the business of conditional promises only. He is willing to bind Himself with no return for the sake of a creation that has just shown Him exactly what it is capable of. That is the engine under everything that follows. The Noahic covenant also has a particular character that gets overlooked. It establishes the rhythm of creation. Seed time and harvest, summer and winter, day and night. The rest of the biblical story will unfold inside that rhythm. Genesis chapter 8 verse 22 says, "These will not cease." The reliability of the natural world is itself part of the covenant with Noah. The reason the Bible can have farming parables, harvest festivals, seasonal language at all, is that the Noahic covenant has put a fence around chaos. The world is safe enough to make a longer story possible. The next covenants can happen because the first one held the floor steady. A few chapters later, the story narrows. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls a man named Abram out of Mesopotamia and promises to make him a great nation. In Genesis chapter 15, the promise is extended. God says Abram's descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Abram believes. And then God does something strange. He tells Abram to bring him animals, a heifer of 3 years old, a she-goat of 3 years old, a ram of 3 years old, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. Abram cuts the larger animals in half and lays the halves opposite each other. He drives away the birds of prey that come to eat the carcasses. The sun goes down. Darkness falls. And then, in Genesis chapter 15, verse 17, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp pass between the pieces. Read that again, because every reader of the Bible should slow down for this. The smoking furnace and the burning lamp are God Himself. The standard Hebrew Bible reading is that these two objects are theophanies, visible manifestations of God's presence. And God walks the path between the carcasses alone. Abram does not walk it. Abram is asleep. The text says a deep sleep fell on him before the ceremony began. The one party walking between the bloody pieces is God Himself. That is not a normal ancient Near Eastern covenant. In a normal berith ceremony, both parties walk between the pieces. Both invoke the curse. Both pledge their lives. In this one, God walks alone. He takes the curse on Himself. If the covenant is broken, the curse falls on him. And here is what should stop you cold. The God of the universe has just stood between bloody animal halves and pledged his own life as the guarantee of his promise to Abram. The smoking furnace is the fire that consumes the offering. The burning lamp is the light that walks the path, and the path is bloody. 2,000 years later, the Apostle Paul will read this scene in Galatians chapter 3 and tell his readers that the promise made to Abraham is the foundation of the entire gospel. Not the law, the promise. The covenant where God walked alone. And that is the second, the covenant of pure promise. The covenant where Abraham could only sleep and God did all the walking. 2 chapters later, in Genesis 17, the covenant with Abraham gets a sign, the sign of circumcision. The mark is on the flesh of every male in Abraham's household. The sign of belonging to this covenant is something carried in the body, not something carried in a document. And the name of the patriarch is changed at this point, from Abram, exalted father, to Abraham, father of many nations. The covenant changes who he is. He is no longer just a man with a name. He is the carrier of a promise that will eventually reach the whole world. 400 years later, the children of Abraham are slaves in Egypt. God hears their groaning. He sends Moses. The plagues fall, the sea opens, and the people walk out of Egypt and arrive at the foot of a mountain in the Sinai desert. The mountain is on fire. Exodus chapter 19. The cloud descends. The trumpet sounds. The people stand at the foot, terrified. God comes down on Mount Sinai in fire and gives the 10 Commandments. The book of the covenant follows. Exodus chapter 21 through 23. Civil regulations, sacrificial instructions, festivals, ethics. The whole moral and ritual life of the people of Israel laid out in the smoke and thunder of the mountain. And then, in Exodus chapter 24, the covenant is ratified. Moses takes the blood of the sacrifices. He sprinkles half on the altar. The altar represents God. He reads the book of the covenant to the people. They answer, "All that the Lord hath said will we do, and be obedient." And Moses takes the rest of the blood and sprinkles it on the people. Exodus chapter 24, verse 8. "Behold, the blood of the covenant, which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words." Blood on the altar, blood on the people, the covenant ratified in a sprinkling that joined both parties under one curse. The Sinai covenant is different from the covenant with Abraham in one critical way. It is conditional. The book of Deuteronomy spells out the conditions in detail. Blessings if Israel keeps the covenant, curses if Israel does not. The bond of life is now mutual. Israel has walked between the pieces. Israel has pledged. And almost immediately, Israel breaks it. Even before Moses comes down from the mountain, the people are dancing around a golden calf. The pattern of the Sinai covenant is set. God gives the law. Israel promises faithfulness. Israel fails. God forgives. Israel fails again. The cycle runs through judges, through kings, through the prophets. The Sinai covenant reveals something about humanity that the earlier covenants only hinted at. People cannot keep the bond they make. The flesh is weak. The heart is divided. The promise is broken almost as soon as the blood dries. That is the third covenant, the covenant of law, the covenant Israel could not keep, and it sets up everything that comes after. But notice the architecture. The Sinai covenant does not replace the Abrahamic covenant. It is added on top of it. The promises to Abraham are still in force. The descendants are still going to be many. The land is still going to be given. The blessing is still going to flow through this family to all the nations. The Sinai covenant is a covenant for shaping a people who are already chosen, not a covenant for becoming chosen. The book of Hebrews will later say this explicitly. The law was given because of transgression, until the seed should come. The law is a tutor, not a foundation. The foundation was laid in Abraham. The Sinai covenant is the schoolroom where the children of Abraham learn what holiness looks like. About 400 years after Moses, a shepherd boy from Bethlehem becomes king of Israel. His name is David. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, while David is sitting in his cedar palace, the prophet Nathan brings him a message from God. And here is what God says. He tells David that he will establish his throne forever. 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 16. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. This is the Davidic covenant, and it carries a specific weight. God is now binding the kingship of Israel to one family, the house of David. The kings of Israel will come from this line, and the language reaches beyond what any earthly dynasty could fulfill. Forever. Every dynasty in the ancient world fell eventually. Every throne was eventually toppled. And God is promising that this one will not be. The promise becomes a problem when the line of David is eventually exiled, when Jerusalem falls, when the throne is empty, when the temple is destroyed. By the time you get to the prophets, the Davidic covenant looks like a broken promise, and the prophets begin to talk about something new. Jeremiah 31:31. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant I made when I took them out of Egypt, the text says, which they broke. A new one. The law will be written on their hearts. They will all know me. I will forgive their iniquity. I will remember their sin no more. That is the prophetic promise. A new covenant, internal, not external, written on the heart, not on tablets. Forgiveness as the foundation, not punishment. 6 centuries later, a man in an upper room in Jerusalem takes a cup of wine and says to his disciples in Luke 22:20, "This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you." The Greek word for testament in that verse is diatheke, the same word for covenant. This is the new covenant in my blood. He is quoting Jeremiah. He is reaching back to the bloody animal halves in Genesis 15 and saying, "The blood that walks between the pieces is mine." He is reaching back to the blood on the people at Sinai and saying, "The blood of the new covenant is my blood, sprinkled on you." He is reaching back to the throne promised to David and saying, "The King of the everlasting throne is sitting at this table with you." Every covenant in the Bible is being gathered into one man at one meal. And the next day, he goes to a cross. The smoking furnace walks the path again. The blood that ratifies the covenant flows from a body nailed to wood. The curse is taken by the one party who never broke the bond. The other party is asleep. Humanity. All of humanity. Every name on every page since Eden. Asleep, like Abram in his stupor, while God walks the path alone. That is the fifth covenant, the covenant in his blood. The author of the book of Hebrews, writing to Jewish Christians in the 1st century, reads this entire arc and lays it out in chapters 8 through 10. The first covenant had a tabernacle. The new covenant has a better one. The first covenant had high priests who died and had to be replaced. The new covenant has a priest who lives forever. The first covenant required sacrifices repeated again and again. The new covenant required one sacrifice, once. We are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. That is Hebrews 10:10. The 5 covenants of the Bible are not 5 separate religions. They are one God working out one purpose in 5 stages, each one a step closer to the final ratification of a relationship he refused to give up on. A garden, a bow in the cloud, a smoking furnace between bloody pieces, a mountain on fire, a king and a throne, a cup of wine in an upper room, a cross on a hill. 5 covenants and one story. The God who keeps binding himself to a creation that keeps breaking the bond. The God who walks alone between the pieces because the only other party in the room is asleep. The God who hangs the weapon of his judgment in the sky and points it at himself. You are inside the last of these covenants. You are at the table where the cup was passed. The blood that ratifies it has already been shed. The covenant has already been cut. And the path between the pieces is one you do not have to walk. He walked it for you. The God who set the bow in the cloud, who passed between the pieces while Abraham slept, who sprinkled blood on the people at the foot of a burning mountain, who promised an everlasting throne to a shepherd from Bethlehem, who spoke through the prophets of a new covenant written on the heart. That God is the same God who took the cup in his hands the night before he died and said, "This is the new covenant in my blood." The whole story has been moving toward this table, and the table is set in front of you today with the cup still on it. If this opened the ark for you, if you have read these stories your whole life and never seen them all bending toward one cross, leave a comment with the covenant that hit hardest. Subscribe to keep going deeper. Share this with someone who would love it. Even one word in the comments helps the channel more than you would think. God bless you.